Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Today we're talking about Chapter 31 of David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. This chapter deals specifically with the resurgence of political conservatism in the United States, beginning around 1975 and going all the way through the decade of the 1980s. Okay, so this will take us all the way to the end of the Cold War. So we begin with the presidency of Jimmy Carter, okay, who wins the election of 1976. And remember, we are just now coming out of a period where the American public has developed a severe sense of mistrust for the federal government, for the military, primarily because of the debacle in Vietnam and because of the Nixon presidency, okay, leading into the Ford presidency, which a lot of people at the time considered to be somewhat illegitimate. Okay, remember, Ford was the very first politically appointed president, and then he turned around and pardoned his predecessor. Okay, so this leads to the American public feeling rather jaded when it comes to the leader of the country. And Jimmy Carter initially is a pretty lackluster president. Okay, he's only known for serving a single term as Georgia's governor at the time, and so once he actually gets in office, he is not really anybody's favorite candidate. Okay. He touts himself as a moderate Southern Democrat, okay, and he says that he's going to try to restrain big government spending, okay, and that's actually one of the biggest characteristics of the Carter presidency is that he does try to streamline a lot of things, he does slash a lot of budgets, and so to a certain extent, he kind of picks up along the same lines of what Nixon and Ford attempted to do with removing a lot of federal welfare programs and so forth, except Carter, in this case, is actually a Democrat. So he's not really targeting so much the exact same things that Nixon did, but he does try to downsize a lot in the federal government. And he is really trying to aim for this idea of efficient leadership and trying to eliminate as much waste as he possibly can. And again, just trying to eliminate things that he thinks are not essential to the government. And ultimately, that mindset ends up working against him in the long run. For one thing, he does also tout the fact that he is openly a quote-unquote born-again Southern Baptist Christian. And again, he's one of the few presidents who tries to tout this idea of evangelical Christianity as being part of his personal character. Okay, we have Jimmy Carter, and later on we'll have George W. Bush doing the exact same thing. Okay, so to a certain extent, it ends up alienating a certain part of the contingency in the United States who have traditionally voted Democrat. In this case, the Catholics living in the North. Okay, so a little bit sandwiched in between those two major contingencies. And Carter, in hindsight, does have a few successes in his first couple of years in office. Okay, he does manage to reduce the size of the White House staff by about a third. And his administration does include much more African Americans and women than any other president before him. Okay, so he does actually make efforts to be more inclusive when it comes to hiring government employees. And he does also something that is a little bit controversial. I mean, at the time, it would have been very controversial in that he actually offers amnesty to several thousands of men who ended up fleeing the country when they came up for the draft notice for Vietnam. Okay, so in the minds of a lot of political conservatives at the time, especially, this would have been very, very unpopular. Okay, so a lot of people who were much more of the pro-military mindset wouldn't have been on board with this. But by doing this and by offering amnesty, he does actually end up reflecting, in some cases anyway, the mindset of some Americans who actually didn't like Vietnam as a war to begin with. Okay, so it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of situation here. And he does manage to reorganize the executive branch a little bit. He reduces a little bit of the red tape, tries to get rid of a few unnecessary offices along the way. And he also creates what is referred to as a $1.6 billion super fund to try to clean up toxic waste sites. Okay, so this is kind of picking up a little bit in the aftermath of what Richard Nixon tried to do with the Environmental Protection Agency and so forth. So he does carry forward a few Nixon-era administrative purposes along the way. Okay, and again, the EPA and NOAA, which was another one of the major government agencies that Nixon began, were kind of a bipartisan effort anyway. Okay, so this doesn't exactly reflect on everything that Nixon tried to do in a conservative sense anyway. And by the end of his first 100 days, Jimmy Carter actually had an enjoyable 75% approval rating with the public. Okay, so this is a pretty, seems like a solid beginning for the most part, at least within the first couple of years of his presidency. And again, just within the first 100 days or so, right? The first 100 days of a presidency tends to be kind of the formative period, right? This is kind of where the president makes an impression on the American people. And initially, it seems like Carter's not doing too bad of a job. He does, however, deal with a lot of shortcomings over time, the longer he's actually in office. And for one thing, his leadership qualities leave a lot to be desired. Okay, instead of actually appearing to be a leader that can actually inspire the American people toward a common goal, he actually comes across more like a very bossy parent. Okay, he's very efficient-minded, which again can work to a certain extent if you want to come across as a bureaucrat, but at the same time too, he also comes across as a micromanager. Okay, he's really eager to downsize government agencies and actually work them himself. Okay, so, and again, this is him trying to tout the idea of shrinking the size of the government so that he can actually slash budgets and so forth, but it doesn't actually work as far as him actually, doling out responsibilities. He absorbs more than he actually disseminates. And the mismanagement of the economy tends to be looked at as Carter's biggest failure in the long term. Okay, for one thing, he authorizes $14 billion in federal spending to try to trigger job growth. Okay, so this is, and again, this is not necessarily something that's altogether Carter's fault either. Okay, we already have an inheritance of an inheritance when it comes to a poor American economy left over all the way from the Johnson era. Okay, remember Johnson refused to increase taxes during the Vietnam War and instead ended up siphoning out a lot of Great Society programs, right? Taking money from those domestic programs and sending the money off to Vietnam. That way, when Vietnam ended and Richard Nixon started to slash a lot of these programs, suddenly the money had to come from somewhere. Okay, so over time, right, it ends up becoming snowballing, in effect, into a bigger problem. And once Carter gets in office, again, he inherits a lot of problems from his predecessors. Okay, so it's not altogether his fault here. He also ends up cutting taxes by $34 billion, which again, probably not the best choice in hindsight, okay, given the recession that the economy was already in the midst of with Nixon and stagflation and so forth. And so once Carter ends up cutting taxes, we end up with a major spike in inflation, and all of a sudden there is a greater sense of unemployment in the United States. And the global energy crisis becomes another major problem. Okay, we already, again, not altogether Carter's fault either, but something that he doesn't really doesn't deal with very well. Okay, for example, beginning all the way back in the early 1970s, when we ended up getting involved in the Yom Kippur War, we sent aid to Israel. The United States ends up falling afoul of OPEC, right? And OPEC ends up causing a 400% price increase on imported petroleum. Okay, so now all of a sudden we have gas shortages in the United States, and even between 1973 and 77, oil prices end up doubling. Okay, and our dependence on foreign oil ends up rising from about 35% on an annual basis to 50%. Okay, just because the gas and oil reserves that we have in the U.S. are slowly beginning to dry up. Okay, and so we're having to actually look to the Middle East to supplement that, and it ends up increasing more and more and more as time wears on. In April of 1977, Carter also presents Congress with what is ultimately a failed energy proposal in which he tries to cut oil consumption in the United States. Okay, tries to get people to, continue the gas rationing, stop using their cars so much. And he, again, kind of comes across as chiding the American people for indulging too much. And the American people at this point are looking for relief, right? They're wanting the ability to actually be able to, spend more rather than less. Okay? And the big precipitating thing that makes all of this even more disconcerting in foreign policy aspect is in 1979, the Islamic Revolution takes place in Iran. Okay, and when this happens and the U.S.-backed regime of the Shah of Iran ends up collapsing, suddenly when Islamic extremists take over, Iranian oil to the U.S. is completely cut off by the religious extremists. Okay, so now all the supplement that we have from the Middle East when it comes to oil reserves has been completely denied to us 100%. Okay, so it just ends up compounding over time. And again, not all of this is Carter's fault, but it ends up snowballing, and his mismanagement of the situation only makes things worse. In July of 1979, Carter ends up retreating to Camp David for 2 weeks to try to figure out what exactly he's going to do about all of this, okay, because he's got a lot on his plate, and he needs to make a decision rather quickly, okay? So disappearing for a couple of weeks, again, in hindsight, doesn't seem like a great thing, even though he is trying to get away to, think things through and come up with a solution, okay? And in the meantime, he's not just staying by himself holed up in Camp David. He does meet with several business leaders, labor leaders, educationalists, religious leaders, and psychiatric leaders in the process to get input from all different aspects of American life. Okay, to try to see what is it that is going to be the best decision that is going to leave the longest standing positive impact. And on July 15th, Carter makes a televised speech saying that America, he knows, has a lack of confidence in him. Okay, and for him to do this is both a good thing and a bad thing. Okay, good in the sense that he is trying for transparency. Okay, he's trying to acknowledge that he knows he has a lot to live up to, that he has a lot of expectations for the American people that he is shouldering, but at the same time, too, acknowledging that without actually presenting them with the decision makes him seem like a victim. Okay, and so for him to kind of have this victim mentality and presenting to himself to the American people as kind of this pitiful leader ends up seeming a little bit weak on the national and even on the international stage to a certain extent. Okay, so again, in hindsight, probably not the greatest decision here. And to make matters worse, not only does he acknowledge his failures as a leader, he also blames America for the country's problems, blames the American people in particular, says that this idea of consumer culture and trying to, bring forth all these new commodities, electronics and so forth, that pop culture and all of this is what is actually causing America's economic problems, not him and not his decision making. Okay, so again, it ends up coming across as a little too preachy. Okay, and the American people no longer believe that Carter really has their best interests at heart. Okay, so again, in hindsight, not the greatest message to send to the American people. And 2 days later, Carter actually takes things a step further by asking over 30 government officials, including his entire executive cabinet, to completely resign so that he can try to slash budgets and save money. Okay, so this is, again, he seems like he's only digging himself a hole further and further and further when it comes to the economy and domestic policy. And only 5 cabinet officers actually end up agreeing. Okay, the rest of them are not very eager for this to happen for obvious reasons. Now, when it comes to his foreign policy, Carter is a little bit more successful here, at least in the short term anyway. By 1978, Carter actually manages to facilitate a peace agreement between the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who you see here with the glasses, and the President of Egypt, Anwar Sadat. Okay, and this is a major thing because Egypt is actually a member of the Arab League, and up until now, the Arab League has absolutely despised the presence of Israel as a separate nation, has not recognized it, and does not want it to exist. Okay, so for a major Arab country like Egypt to actually come out and have some sort of agreement with Israel in any shape or form is a big deal. Okay, so in September of 1978, Carter invites both of these men to Camp David for 12 days, and they end up signing what is called the Camp David Accords. Okay, it's 2 big treaties that occur between Israel and Egypt. And the first treaty provides the basic framework for peace between these 2 nations, okay? Because, again, traditionally, these 2 nations are diametrically opposed in terms of their religious beliefs, in terms of their goals as people, as nations, and so forth. And, one tends to, disavow the other entirely. So this is a big deal. The Israelis pledge that they are going to end whatever military occupation of the Sinai region of Egypt that they have already undertaken, right? They're going to try to get rid of all that completely. And the Egyptians promise that they are going to allow the Israelis to have access to the Suez Canal once again. If you recall, back in I believe it was in the 50s or the 60s, right, Egypt and the Israelis were already in the midst of a small war over the Suez Canal, okay, and it was the Suez War is what it was referred to, right? So for only about 15 or 20 years later, for this to actually end in a peace accord seems like a pretty big deal. Now, the second treaty is a little bit more specific, okay? It calls for more comprehensive settlement of Arab and Israeli tensions, okay? And it's more itemized here, okay? For one thing, Israel is going to allow the Palestinians who are living in the Israeli-controlled West Bank and Gaza Strip to be able to govern themselves, okay? And this is kind of a reversal of something that is was a long-standing system in Islamic law for a very long time when the Ottoman Empire was still in order, right? Something that was called the Dhimmi law, okay? And the idea here was that basically if you are a minority group, an ethnic minority group living within a greater majority, then the majority group is going to allow that minority group to govern themselves based on their own laws. Okay, so again, kind of a reversal of situations here, but something that seems like it might work out, at least temporarily anyway. And Sadat makes the really big decision that he, as president of Egypt, is going to recognize Israel as a nation. And again, anytime a president does this on the international stage, it's a big deal, right? You're legitimizing a country existing and being a sovereign nation. Unfortunately, though, this has extremely major repercussions, especially for Sadat himself. The Arab League actually is so incensed by Sadat's decision here that they expel Egypt from the Arab League, and they brand Sadat a traitor and have him assassinated. Okay, so unfortunately, this is a situation where clearly the rest of the Arab League nations are not going to be on board with this, and fighting still continues to this very day over the question of Israel actually existing as a nation. Okay, so this is it seems like a drop in the bucket compared to everything else, and it could have led to greater peace concessions if the time and the patience had been given to it. But as we can see, that was not the case. The one big thing that Carter does try to associate America with, beginning at this point going forward, even though America never is able to quite live up to his expectations, he's kind of like Woodrow Wilson in this sense, is to try to dedicate America to the idea of human rights when it comes to foreign policy. Okay, and anytime America gets involved in a foreign conflict from this point forward, the question of human rights tends to comes into question. Okay, not necessarily whether or not American soldiers are involved in crimes against humanity or anything, but America uses this kind of as an undercurrent or a backdrop for its mission in intervening in foreign affairs. Right? Is someone else's human rights being violated in the process? Okay, and again, for Carter to do this, it causes a ceiling of expectations that American soldiers, politicians, and just the American people in general are not always able to live up to for one reason or another. Okay. For one thing, he does create an Office of Human Rights within the State Department itself, so he does try to make this an officially monitored thing within the government. And he also very selectively cuts off funding to certain governments that he deems to be too repressive, okay? And so when it comes to nations like Iran, for example, the Shah of Iran at this point in time, when he was actually still allied to the United States, was a very autocratic ruler. But because the Shah of Iran allowed the United States access to the oil reserves in Iran's territory, it allowed the United States to overlook the fact that he was a totalitarian leader. Okay, so again, Carter's not always practicing what he preaches here. And he also attempts to bring more focus back onto the plights of Native Americans, African Americans who are still facing institutionalized racism and violent racism to a certain extent in the United States, as well as a few U.S. allies. Okay, and again, U.S. allies end up being a little bit more critical of Carter's statements here. Okay, because Carter is not exactly paying equal attention to all of this at the same time. Okay, he's not really, even though he does actually try to make his cabinet more diverse and so forth, he doesn't really launch any major programs, right? He doesn't really give a lot of government spending toward African American civil rights, doesn't really extend any kind of welfare programs that perhaps his Democratic predecessors would have done. Okay, he's so focused on slashing budgets and making the economy the best that he thinks it can be that he ends up overlooking some of the major problems in society itself. Okay, so again, another one of Carter's limitations over time. He does manage to return control of the Panama Canal Zone to the Panamanian government, okay, and it seems like it's something that's overdue in the long run, right? Something that conservatives in particular are not happy with him over this either, by the way, primarily because Teddy Roosevelt, who himself was a conservative to a certain extent, actually was the first one to, obviously get the Panama Canal Zone actually under U.S. control, and so for us to give this back is basically, in the eyes of conservatives, giving up some sort of American sovereignty. Okay, that he's giving too much to a foreign power by doing this. And the Canal Zone is eventually transferred to Panama as 100% at the end of 1999. Okay, so it takes, again, at least another 20 years or so before this can be fully put into effect. Now, again, in the Middle East, this is one of the major regions that becomes a focal point, especially under the Carter presidency moving forward. Okay, beginning in the 1970s, this is when the two major superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, begin to look at the Middle East as a potential area for natural resources and for especially oil as a major commodity. And if they can get one particular country or another on their side in the process, or even dominate them in the long run, then it can grant a widespread access to this type of resource. Okay. And on that particular note, the Soviets end up invading Afghanistan in December of 1979 with 100,000 soldiers. Okay. And Afghanistan at this point is largely decentralized in terms of its control. Okay, most of the individuals who control Afghanistan are Islamic jihadis and ethnic warlords. Okay, so it's not really, doesn't exactly have a major central government at this point. Okay. And the Soviet army, this is the first time that it's really been deployed outside of Europe since the Second World War. Okay, so the Soviets have not had any troops on the ground in any foreign country since the Second World War. Okay, the U.S. has already done this, obviously, in Vietnam and Korea and so forth, where the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and all that have acted as Soviet proxies. Okay, so this is the first time the Soviets are trying to directly come into conflict with another country. And it's referred sometimes to as the Soviet Vietnam because the Soviets end up occupying Afghanistan for several years, okay, for the better part of a decade or more. They end up, kind of getting embroiled with these Islamic jihadis, and it becomes a very bitter, long, drawn-out guerrilla warfare conflict. And in January of 1980, Carter actually starts to take more and more steps against the Soviets here because he believes that their occupation of Afghanistan is something that he can use potentially to his advantage. Okay. For one thing, he refuses to sign a second strategic arms limitation agreement. Okay, so SALT II never actually comes to fruition. Okay, we don't agree to do any more concessions to the Soviets when it comes to limiting the number of missiles that we have or building up any kind of strategic defense system, right? We don't actually extend that much more after this. And Carter actually begins to send money and weapons to Afghanistan, specifically to the individuals he refers to as freedom fighters, okay? The jihadis themselves and the ethnic warlords who are fighting against the Soviets, okay? So in hindsight, given everything that has occurred within the last 20 or so years here in America, this seems kind of like an alien idea here, okay? And he also requests large increases when it comes to military spending, so that in case we do actually get in a hot ground war with the Soviets, we have the ability to back that up with actual physical presence when it comes to the military. And he also requires all 19-year-old men to register for the draft. In this particular instance, again, is something where people are already feeling pretty burned by what's happened with Vietnam, and they don't want a second Vietnam. Okay, so the American people are not happy about this idea at all. He also calls for a full boycott of the 1980 Olympics, which is actually scheduled to occur in Moscow. Okay, and remember, he is someone who is, during this entire period of détente that we've had with Nixon and with Ford, and even to a certain extent with Eisenhower and all that, even going back a little further, we end up going into a period where we're reversing all of our policies when it comes to the Soviets now. Okay, we're ramping up military spending, and we're kind of becoming a little bit more aggressive all over again. So again, seems like Carter is not really making great decisions, even when it comes to foreign policy here. So when it comes to the Soviets actually being in Afghanistan, it takes them 9 years to actually end up vacating Afghanistan in the long term, and 15,000 Soviets are killed by the Afghans in the meantime. In January 1979, this is when the actual Islamic Revolution occurs, okay? And the revolution itself that occurs in Iran is actually a leftist revolution. It actually has virtually nothing to do with the Islamic extremists themselves. The pro-American government in Iran, again, is headed by the Shah of Iran, who you see here. It's Mohammad Reza Pahlavi is his name. And the Shah is actually so unpopular with his own people because he is an autocratic ruler. Okay, he suppresses free speech. He tries to prevent people from speaking out against the government. Anybody who does ends up disappearing. Right? It's similar in some aspects to what the Soviet Union was doing under Joseph Stalin. Okay. But again, he is ostensibly a democratic ruler. Okay, ostensibly. Now, when the actual revolution ends up occurring, it's just the vast majority of the people of Iran who actually end up overthrowing him, and they finally manage to get him to actually step down. Right? He actually ends up handing over his rulership to the people themselves. Okay, and in the immediate aftermath, Islamic extremists end up stepping into where this power vacuum occurs, and they end up taking over the government. Okay, so this goes from being a leftist, potentially communistic type of revolution into all of a sudden becoming what is essentially an Islamic fascist regime that ends up taking over here. And we have hundreds of former officials under the Shah who are captured, imprisoned, tortured, and executed by the extremists. Okay. And even just the Iranian people themselves, who are not willing to adhere to Islamic social codes, end up doing the same thing. So suddenly there's all these new laws that begin to come into existence in Iran, where women have to wear the hijab on their head, for example. People are not allowed to have major gatherings. Alcohol is outlawed. Playing cards, chessboards, Western clothing and music and culture of any kind is viewed as being subversive to this new government. And so, again, the landscape of Iran ends up changing virtually overnight. Okay, if you look at the capital city of Tehran, pictures of it from the mid-1970s, it looks like Southern California. But again, if you fast forward to 1979, 1980, it's the more modern interpretation of what you tend to see on television, in the news, and so forth when it comes to the Middle East. Right? People are back to wearing traditional garb, women's heads are covered, and so forth. So it completely changes, again, virtually overnight. And immediately after this happens, there is also a very sharp drop when it comes to oil production. Okay, so a lot of countries all over the world suddenly have price hikes when it comes to gasoline. Okay, and again, part of that has to do not only with the fact that the production itself comes to a slow halt, but also because Iran is not really exporting anything to Western countries anymore. And in October, the Shah himself is actually allowed asylum in America for a very brief time to treat him for cancer. And the militants in Iran who have taken over the government are suddenly outraged. Okay, and they are calling for his head. Okay, they want him to be brought back to Iran and for his wealth to be given over to their regime. Okay. And they're so incensed over this that in November of 1979, there is a mob that ends up storming the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and 66 diplomats and staff members, 52 of whom are Americans, are taken hostage. Okay? And the leader of Iran at this point, the supreme leader, as he's called, is the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Okay? And the Ayatollah Khomeini is known for being the primary spiritual leader of Iran at this point. And again, he's referred to as the supreme leader because he's the one who has essentially the final decision when it comes to these types of things. And he is the one who demands that the Shah and all of his wealth is given over to his regime in exchange for the hostages to be released. Okay, and so this is referred to as the Iranian hostage crisis. In April of 1980, after several months of these individuals being held hostage for so long, Carter tries to authorize a risky rescue attempt using U.S. commandos, and it ends up being a dismal failure because there is a helicopter crash that occurs in the desert outside of Tehran where 8 Americans are killed. Okay. Finally, what ends up kind of deterring the Ayatollah from continuing to have these Americans held hostage is something that potentially is kind of an out of the frying pan into the fire type situation, because in September of 1980, Saddam Hussein, who has taken over as the dictator of Iraq in 1979, suddenly turns around and attacks Iran. Okay, and this begins a war known as the Iran-Iraq War that lasts from 1980 until 1989. Okay, so suddenly the Ayatollah is caught off guard because his new regime is kind of a weakened regime. Iran is in a kind of an unstable situation here, politically speaking. And so Saddam Hussein decides that he is going to try to attack Iran and take over the country so that he can gain access to the oil reserves. Okay. So again, this lasts for the better part of a decade, and over 1 million Iranians end up being killed in the process here. So this is a very long, drawn-out conflict. And it takes until January of 1981 before the Iranian hostage crisis comes to a full close. Okay, and it takes the action of Carter actually releasing several billions of dollars of Iranian assets to the Ayatollah so that these people can be ransomed. Okay, so 444 days these people are held captive by the Iranian Islamic militants. Now, religiously speaking, everything in the United States is suddenly becoming diametrically opposed to what we see in the Middle East. Okay, Ronald Reagan steps forward for the 1980 election to be the spokesman for the Republican Party and for this new coalition in conservative politics that's referred to as the New Right. Okay, and Reagan has all kinds of goals for his presidency, okay, if he does get elected. He plans to slash social welfare programs even further than they've already been slashed, number one. He plans to increase military spending to quote-unquote win the Cold War. Okay, so we're not only are we backtracking on stuff that Nixon and Ford have done, now we're actually ramping things up even more, taking it all the way back to basically Truman and Eisenhower era levels of aggression when it comes to the Soviets. He plans to dismantle what he refers to as the bloated federal bureaucracy. In other words, he is going to shrink the federal government as much as he can. Restore states' rights, which again ends up pleasing Southern conservatives who are still nursing a grudge because of the Civil War Reconstruction period. He wants to reduce taxes and reduce government regulation of businesses, so he's kind of going back to a little bit of a laissez-faire situation, kind of like what we saw in the late 19th century. He's also going to appoint conservative judges to the federal courts, okay, try to get as much legislation for, the civil rights legislations and so forth halted as much as he can. He's also planning to try to ban abortion and reinstitute prayer in public schools, neither of which he manages to do. And his slogan for his 1980 election is, "Let's make America great again," which Donald Trump ends up plagiarizing for the 2016 election. And in the meantime, there is a larger tax revolt that is taking place in the United States that is more of a grassroots type of movement here. Okay, the American people themselves are beginning it without any real support from major politicians here. For one thing, the consumer prices in the country and the home values are both on the rise here, and that ends up leading to property tax hikes in the United States as well. And so in 1978 in California, there is a proposition that's planned called Proposition 13, okay? And this is supposed to slash property taxes by about 57%, and actually ends up amending the state constitution down to its origins here to try to make it more difficult for the state to be able to raise taxes. And suddenly there's a larger tax revolt that is spreading in the United States that's referred to by some people as a modern Boston Tea Party. This is where we get the new Tea Party coalition in the United States that started to have a major comeback in the first few years of the 21st century. And again, when it comes to religious conservatism in the United States, this new system that's referred to as the religious right comes into the forefront. Okay, we've already had a period of time in the 60s and 70s where evangelical Christianity has begun to make a large comeback. It's had a presence in radio programs. We started to see the rise of televangelists now beginning in the 70s, leading into the 80s. And religion and Christianity in particular, evangelical Christianity more specifically, has had a very large influence on American politics during this time period. Okay? So in the 1980s, there are much larger and much more well-funded systems where Catholic and evangelicals groups are actually beginning to have their own TV programs, their own radio stations. They're actually even sponsoring their own schools and universities. And we start to see terms like megachurches and televangelists become more popular now. And in particular, we have the emergence in the figure of Jerry Falwell, who organizes what he refers to as the moral majority. And Jerry Falwell is one of the primary representatives of this televangelist movement. Okay, he's extremely right-wing conservative when it comes to politics, and is extremely hardline Christian fundamentalist when it comes to his religious beliefs. And he promotes what he wants in terms of a Republican-led government, including a laissez-faire stance when it comes to business regulation. He wants a complete reversal of Roe v. Wade, again, which would undo the abortion laws in the United States. He also goes so far as to want to replace evolution in any and all school textbooks with the Christian story of the creation myth. Okay? He also wants a return of prayer to public schools, which again lines up directly with what Reagan wants. And he even goes so far as to try to revert gender roles back to what they were in the 1940s and 50s, where women were, essentially forced to be submissive to their husbands. And he also refers to communism as a form of quote-unquote pagan totalitarianism, which is kind of a confusing little parallel that he's trying to make there. Okay, communism has virtually nothing to do with paganism at all, and totalitarianism perhaps, but he's making a little bit of a false parallel here. Now, when it comes to feminism and so forth, we start to see an actual pushback and an anti-feminist movement that actually begins in response to new wave feminism as well. Okay, so by the late 1970s, we actually see an anti-feminist movement that is actually becoming a much more well-funded system, kind of ballooning up at the same time as this new religious right is starting to gain traction as well. And the anti-feminist movement is actually led by a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who you see here. And she specifically campaigns, you see her in the background here as well, campaigns for prevention of the Equal Rights Amendment from being ratified in 38 states in the United States. Okay, if it is ratified, then greater concessions will be made for women's reproductive rights, for abortion, for birth control, and so forth. But Schlafly is so hardline conservative about this that a lot of women actually begin to look at her as being somewhat of a traitor to the feminist cause. Right? She seems like she is a little bit antithetical here, that she is actually giving up some of her own rights in favor of her religious and political beliefs. And she forms a group that is referred to as Stop ERA. And Stop, rather unimaginatively in hindsight, just stands for Stop Taking Our Privileges. Okay? And again, seems a little bit ironic because the Equal Rights Amendment would grant potentially more privileges to women. So again, seems a little bit antithetical in hindsight, but at the time she was fighting for what she believed is right. Take from this what you will. Okay. And anyway, her entire program here, Stop ERA, is based again on several different irrational fears that she believes and that moral conservatives and political conservatives believe are going to happen if the Equal Rights Amendment is passed. Okay. For one thing, she believes that husbands are going to start abandoning their wives. Okay. Again, where this comes from is kind of irrational and doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Second one is she believes that women are going to be forced into military service, okay? And to a certain extent, some women at this point are actually campaigning for women to actually be able to serve in the armed forces, okay? It's not as widespread at this point as it becomes in the next couple of decades or so, but beginning in this time period, she is actually concerned that this is going to something that's suddenly going to be forced on women somehow. She states that gay quote-unquote perverts are going to be given the right to marry. Again, gay marriage is something that the conservative aspect of society has feared, I guess, since the 1960s when homosexuality was essentially decriminalized in the United States in the public sphere. And gender equality, she believes, is something that is going to ultimately violate biblical teachings, okay, about a woman's quote-unquote God-given role as a nurturer and a helpmate to her husband. Okay. And again, this to the vast majority of liberal America at this point, this seems like a very limited scope of what this could potentially have. Okay, the Equal Rights Amendment doesn't really cover any of these items at all when it comes to this type of thing. Again, it's supposed to grant more reproductive rights to women, to grant more rights when it comes to divorce settlements and things like that. Greater, equal rights when it comes to being paid and so forth. So it seems like it's only going to be things that are beneficial, but she is actually pitching it in a way to make it seem like it's going to be a bad thing. Unsurprisingly, no states in the South or in the West, which is primarily controlled by conservatives at this point, end up ratifying the ERA as a direct result of what Schlafly ends up doing here. Okay, so it seems like she is potentially sabotaging her own gender-based movement here. Okay, and again, some women view her as essentially a traitor to the cause. And as a direct result of everything that Schlafly ends up doing here, and again with the emergence of this new right in politics, we end up with a pro-life movement instead of a pro-choice movement. Okay, and the two have considered each other to be a foil of one another ever since. And we also get more organized groups such as the National Right to Life Committee, which gets even a lot more support from the National Conference of Catholics. Okay, so the Catholic Church is beginning to actually almost directly sponsor this in many ways. Catholic Church has been traditionally very anti contraceptive. Okay, so when it comes to using contraception, abortion, of course, is another thing the Catholic Church has spoken out against several times. And again, this becomes a much more emotionally charged argument now, right? The conservatives, Catholics, or evangelical Christians in particular, begin to refer to abortion as murder, okay, saying that unborn children, the fetus itself, because it perhaps has a heartbeat, perhaps because it is developed past a certain stage or whatever, that suddenly life begins at the moment of conception. Okay, and so this is, again, take from this what you will. I won't take a stance on this here, but in the larger scope of American arguments in the political and in the moral and ethical sphere, this has become a gargantuan argument, especially leading into the 21st century. Okay, so this is kind of the beginning of when a lot of that starts to blow out of proportion. And Reagan himself, of course, is in support of almost everything that Schlafly is doing here, okay? He supports what he refers to as traditional family values, traditional gender roles, which, again, are very much a dichotomy here, male versus female, right? This idea of women being submissive, men being dominant, the quote-unquote rights of the unborn, which we just discussed. And of course, he also gets the support of a lot of Northern Democrats, most of whom, again, are traditionally Catholic constituents. Okay, so again, Northern Democrats end up changing over to a certain extent, and in some cases, they end up joining the Republican Party in the long run. Going back just a little bit, leading up when it comes to businesses and finances, in 1972, several different corporations formed what is referred to as the Business Roundtable to try to promote their interests in Congress. Okay, so they act as kind of a lobbying group here. And most of the political action committees that we start to see in the 1970s leading into the 80s are primarily there to try to distribute money to pro-business political candidates. In other words, to try to essentially grease the palms of individuals who are pro-business politicians, okay, to try to get them elected into office. And it seems like Ronald Reagan is one of those individuals. Okay. And several different conservative think tanks, quote unquote, start to erupt as a certain, aftermath of this. So we get groups like the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and the Heritage Foundation who kind of do the same thing, right? They're trying to figure out who they can push to the front of the line as being an individual who can represent their interests in the White House and Congress and so forth. And by 1980, conservatism has grown exponentially from what it was in the 1960s. Okay, we didn't really start to see Republican conservatism until the election of 1964 with Barry Goldwater, and so within the last 15 or 16 years, it has become a political powerhouse all of a sudden. Okay, so it's getting a lot of well-funded sponsorship from corporations now, from politicians, from religious leaders and so forth. It's very, very energetic, and it has very carefully crafted ideas when it comes to engaging the American public, getting into debates with them over ethical dilemmas and so forth, and trying to pitch things in a much more moralistic light. Now, when it comes to Ronald Reagan's domestic policy in terms of the economy, okay, this becomes something that is extremely controversial in the long run, because in 1981 he signed something called the Economic Recovery Tax Act, okay, or sometimes it's called IRTA. And this is supposed to cut personal income taxes by 25%. Again, this seems like it's something that could potentially help the American economy for the most part. Okay. It also lowers the maximum tax rate from 70% to 50% beginning in 1982. So he is cutting taxes dramatically, and it seems like this could be a way of getting out of the economic recession that we saw in the 1970s. And he also offers a very broad array of different tax concessions so that people can actually get a bit of a tax break, get more tax refunds, and potentially what he wants them to do is to take this money and reinvest it back in the economy somehow, spend money. Okay? And that becomes one of the biggest features of the 1980s when it comes to consumer society. Everybody is buying stuff. And he believes that this is a common sense economic plan, right? It seems like this is the easiest way out of things. And again, the whole stagflation scenario of the 1970s under Nixon is a direct result of several excessive corporate taxes that what he believes, and personal income taxes. Okay, and he believes that if he can just kind of cut this little element out of the whole situation, then everything will suddenly fix itself. Okay, it's not exactly that simple though. He also includes several incentives to try to increase productivity, to try to save money, and again, to try to reinvest in economic expansion. Okay, but most of this gets weakened by the limitations in all this. Okay. He also tries to provide some kind of a tax cut specifically on the wealthy, most of whom, by the way, are his constituents who are voting him into office. He says that if he can get them to spend their tax savings on business expansion and consumer goods, then this is somehow going to have some kind of a trickle-down effect. That if the upper classes spend all of their money and put it back into the economy, then suddenly the floor of living will rise for the middle class and for the working class as well. Okay, but it doesn't have the effect that he expects. Because in November, the economy has gone into full-blown recession all over again. Okay, again, part of this is the fact that the upper class who has been given these large tax cuts end up either saving their money or they invest it in something that is not really going to help the rest of the country. Okay. And David Stockman, who is one of his advisors here, proposes several reductions in federal spending, okay, specifically targets Social Security and Medicare, both of which affect the middle class and the working class. Okay, so everything that Reagan is doing here in terms of his economic plan is only really benefiting the upper class. Okay, and this is one of the biggest criticisms of Reagan in the long run, is that he doesn't really doesn't pay attention to the people who need these kind of tax cuts the most. And Reagan, to his credit, refuses to make these kind of cuts because he believes that this is going to end up sabotaging the promise of a balanced budget. Okay, not that it's really going to hurt the middle class and the working class, but because it's going to make him into a liar here, essentially. So instead, he continues to give large federal subsidies to corporations, to agribusinesses, and he makes massive increases in military spending, more than most of the other presidents before him. Over the course of 5 years, he spends $1.2 trillion in military spending, ramping up nuclear stockpiles, and eventually also coming out with a defense system against incoming nuclear weapons, okay, violating the SALT Treaty. And the federal deficit ends up triggering the worst economic recession since the 1930s. Okay, and again, this is considered to be Reagan's greatest failure in doing all this because he doesn't really seem to understand all the little minor intricacies of the economy and just kind of makes big decisions without thinking of the repercussions in the long run. So by 1982, we have 10 million Americans who are suddenly unemployed. Okay, and by the 1982 midterms, the Democrats end up picking up 26 seats in the House of Representatives. Okay, so he's starting to lose ground here, politically speaking. But by the summer of 1983, there is an economic recovery that is underway here. Okay, the increased government spending, the lower interest rates, and the lower tax rates all seem to like they are potentially balancing things out in the long term. Seems like it wasn't really going to work very well at the beginning, but now it's kind of starting to level off a little bit, okay? But this idea of what is referred to as Reaganomics is not really helping, okay? Because the federal deficit is still higher in terms of Reagan when it comes to all of Reagan's predecessors combined, okay? Higher than all of his predecessors combined, okay? So because of all the spending here, it seems like this is going to help the economy in the long term potentially, but there's a long way to go before this ever actually ends up balancing out. Now, when it comes to liberalism in general, as we've already seen with a lot of the promises that Reagan makes, even before he gets into the White House, he actively ends up campaigning against liberalism wherever it can be found in the American government. Okay? For one thing, we've already seen the efforts of Phyllis Schlafly working kind of as a proxy for Reagan to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, to try to get rid of legalized abortion, and to get rid of equal pay proposals as well. Okay, so a lot of the efforts of social movements that we saw during the 60s and 70s seem like they're being roadblocked and potentially undone here in the early 1980s. The only real concession that's made to the role of women in politics under Reagan is the appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female Supreme Court justice. Okay? And unfortunately, this is viewed in hindsight in many ways as a token gesture, right? Something where Reagan is saying, okay, here you go, we can actually put a woman in this particular office, and it doesn't seem to really undermine his primary goal to extend conservatism in politics. Okay, so it's again kind of viewed as this token gesture more than anything else. But again, at the same time that he does this, he ends up cutting a lot of funding when it comes to civil rights enforcement, and he also cuts funding for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Okay, so a lot of the actual federal acts that were done in conjunction with the Civil Rights Acts of 1965 or 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he ends up kind of backpedaling on a lot of that, cuts funding to a lot of it. And he also specifically opposes renewing the Voting Rights Act of 1965, even though Congress, to its credit, does manage to overrule him on this. Okay, so and if he had allowed this to happen, it would have severely limited the rights of African Americans and other minorities to vote. It could have put up further roadblocks and could have allowed political conservatism to continue unheeded in all this. So again, not to really pitch this in a matter of good versus bad here, but this is a situation where this is not a good plan. By 1983, though, the American economy is finally beginning to rebound from everything that's happened with the fallout from Reaganomics. Okay, the stock market is suddenly rising very dramatically. We end up with what is called supply-side economics that are actually working, even though the budget deficit is growing exponentially at the same time. Okay, so even though we are actually churning out more consumer products and so forth, and people are actually spending more money now, the growing deficit in the government is actually ending up outpacing everything else that the rest of the economy is achieving. And so Reagan begins to remove a lot of price controls when it comes to oil and natural gas to try to see if he can inject even more into the economy. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, at this point, who has now kind of become our new supplier for oil here, since Iran has kind of shut itself off from us, it's pressured to increase its oil production. Okay, and this equals a decline in energy prices, which also, by extension, leads to a little bit more economic growth. So we kind of got a little bit of a chain here going that's going to end up injecting perhaps a little bit more into the American economy. And so in 1984, this new term that starts to be referred to as the Reagan Revolution becomes a major talking point in politics, how he has taken the federal government and reshaped it into a conservative powerhouse here. Okay, and Republicans begin to tout the phrase that America is back and standing tall. Okay, and again, this is in the minds of conservatives and pro-Reagan voters and so forth. The whole idea of making America great again, quote unquote, is something that they like here. The idea of America being economically dominant over the rest of the world, being politically and militarily dominant. Okay, calling America great is essentially trying to harken back to America's stance at the very end of the Second World War, okay, where basically all other countries of the world are decimated and are starving, and America is the only one who has a stable economy. Okay, so that's kind of what this entire idea is summed up in terms of an image. When it comes to the election of 1984, Democrats nominate Walter Mondale, who was Carter's vice president. And Mondale actually sets a major precedent here because he actually chooses a woman as his running mate here, okay, Geraldine Ferrero. Okay. And Mondale, unfortunately, the one thing that causes him to end up having a major hurdle in his campaign, aside from the popularity of conservatism, is that he promises that he's going to have to raise taxes. Okay, and ultimately, over time, this does end up hurting his campaign. Okay, so he doesn't really ever get a whole lot of traction in 1984. And Reagan ends up winning 59% of the popular vote, losing only the state of Minnesota and the District of Columbia, ironically enough. Okay, so D.C. Actually ends up voting Democrat instead of voting Republican here. Now, his primary goal as president is for Reagan to, quote-unquote, end and win the Cold War. Okay. And he believes that the way to do that is not really through the economy so much, but to build up military strength and a nuclear arsenal that can basically rival the Soviets and end up causing them to become submissive over time. Okay? And he's even caught in a specific speech at one point, and it's not even on a hot mic. He actually directly refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. Okay, and funny enough, he actually does this in the aftermath of seeing Star Wars. Okay, so a lot of people draw a parallel here that he is actually viewing the Soviet Union in the same way that that moviegoers would view the Empire in the Star Wars universe, right? And so we now end up with a new presidential doctrine that is referred to as the Reagan Doctrine, okay, saying that we are going to combat the Soviets even if it means partnering with brutal dictatorships. Okay, so we are basically going into this situation of what is essentially a very dangerous doctrine. Okay, this is the idea of my enemy is my enemy, enemy of my enemy is my friend, but at the same time, too, we're giving up a certain amount of moral stance here, right? We're allowing ourselves to be associated with brutal dictatorships in order to achieve the end means. Okay, so the end justifies the means here. It's a very Machiavellian principle. And he says that Nixon and Kissinger were both too soft when it came to the Soviets. We don't need to make deals with them. We need to completely blow them off the face of the earth. And so we end up with most of the military spending during this time period being focused on the buildup of nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. Okay, defense spending ends up amounting to about 1/4 of all government expenditures under Reagan. And Reagan ends up going back on the first SALT treaty, which, again, is something that Nixon actually managed to pull off in 1983, because Reagan announces what he refers to as the Strategic Defense Initiative. Okay, and this is something that never actually came to fruition, thankfully. Otherwise, this would have probably incensed the Soviets and could have led to a nuclear exchange. It's something that is nicknamed the Star Wars Initiative by the media. Okay, and what this plan was supposed to be is something that is basically it amounts to science fiction. It's something that that technology had not caught up with yet. And what the plan was to launch strategic defense satellites into the atmosphere that would be able to shoot down nuclear warheads with laser weapons. Okay, and again, this sounds immediately like science fiction here. Okay, this is something that Reagan envisioned, that he was telling the American people was actually going to come to fruition, and it never actually did. So this would have been a massive defensive shield with these satellites with laser weapons to, quote, intercept and destroy Soviet missiles in the air. Okay, and again, this is something that would have violated the SALT Treaty, saying that we promised that we were not going to build up any kind of defense initiative as an act of goodwill, act of good faith. And so for Reagan to come out and do this automatically is kicking the hornet's nest. And again, this is all based on untested technology and completely violates the 1972 SALT I Treaty altogether. Okay, so very, very bad decision on his part here. And he ends up funneling $30 billion into a program that never comes to fruition. So $30 billion essentially goes down the tubes for something that never actually happens. And the Soviets actually are very alarmed by this, as one can imagine, and they actually launched their own very extensive research and research and development program, R&D program, in response, that actually, in hindsight, ends up bankrupting the Soviet Union. Okay, so even though this is a major bluff and seems like a very poor decision on Reagan's part, could have had some really bad repercussions, actually ends up causing the Soviets to end up losing a lot of resources in the long run. And the moniker known as MAD is something that is associated with this Reagan Doctrine, and something that is extremely frightening for a lot of people who lived during this time period, because MAD is something that stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Okay? And this particular doctrine is, if one country or another, if the Soviet Union or the United States ever launched nuclear missiles at the other, then the person or the country who is being attacked would in turn launch all of their nuclear arsenal. Okay, and just one of these nuclear warheads, right? One of these H-bombs, right, had the capability to basically irradiate all life on the planet. Okay, so if we launch every single nuclear weapon in all arsenals all over the world, we would essentially destroy the planet. Okay, that was the entire doctrine of mutually assured destruction, that we are going to, if one of us is destroyed, then we're taking everybody with us. Okay, and so people suddenly are living in fear that the Soviet Union is going to launch nuclear missiles again. Okay, for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so we're taking things back by 20 or more years at this point. Trying to backpedal and try to intimidate the Soviets into quote unquote losing the Cold War. Okay, so it's the doctrine of brinkmanship, but pushing things over the brink here. So it's a very dangerous way of doing things. But somehow Reagan manages to bluff enough here to where the Soviets actually call his bluff and end up bankrupting themselves. Now, in the midst of all this is something that's referred to as the Iran-Contra Affair. Okay, and all of this indicates that the United States has somehow been secretly selling arms to Iran after the Islamic Revolution has occurred. Okay, and by this point, the Islamic extremists who took over Iran in 1979 absolutely hate America. Okay, they constantly have anti-American propaganda. They believe that all Western culture is decadent, that it is completely against Islamic values, and so for us to be suddenly selling arms to Iran secretly seems like it's violating some kind of treaty somewhere along the lines, or some kind of unspoken agreement that we're basically funding our own enemies here. And the whole goal in this little undercover affair here is basically to try to secure the release of the hostages that are being held, not just in Iran, but also in Lebanon by several extremist groups that are sympathetic to Iran. Okay, so we're basically, it's kind of like the CIA during the 1950s, going into countries and having these little, under the radar operations to try to manipulate foreign affairs. Okay. And again, this completely goes against everything that Reagan has promised the American people, too, because he claims that America does not negotiate with terrorists. And this particular phrase has been touted by several Republican presidents ever since. Okay. And so the Iran-Contra Affair is a very complicated situation, but there's several different covert actions that are carried out by Reagan administration officials to try to basically secure some kind of release of U.S. hostages, and to get Iran to basically back down on some of its hatred for the United States. And it surrounds the Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North here. Okay, he is the one who is secretly selling military supplies to Iran and using the proceeds from these undercover sales, backroom sales here, to support Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Okay, and the aid that would have been sent to Nicaragua in an official capacity was banned by Congress. Okay, Nicaragua at this point is engaged in a large-scale, essentially a revolution in its own right. Some kind of a civil war is going on there, and so the U.S. is not supposed to take a side in this. But under Oliver North, they're actually going in and again working under the radar, trying to get this to actually occur. Now, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, John Poindexter, and CIA Director William Casey are all in approval of North's actions here. Okay, they all say that to him specifically, and behind closed doors, that they approve of what he's doing. North, though, ends up destroying a lot of incriminating evidence here when the news gets out that he's actually been doing this. So he tries to cover his tracks. And McFarlane actually ends up attempting suicide before he's convicted of withholding information from Congress. Okay, so now all of a sudden, when this stuff does come out, these men are all basically in violation of war crimes here, right? They're doing stuff behind the scenes that they're not supposed to be doing. Poindexter here in the middle ends up resigning and actually receives a 6-month jail sentence for obstruction of justice here and obstruction of Congress, and Oliver North is fired. Okay. William Casey, though, actually denies any connection to the operation and ends up dying of a brain tumor before he could really ever testify. Okay, so all of these men end up actually getting off with a relatively light sentence when and where they are sentenced in hindsight. Okay. And Reagan appoints a 3-member commission to try to investigate the scandal, and all blame is actually ended up being placed on Reagan's loose administrative style, okay, once the report actually comes out in 1987. So this is kind of an egg on Reagan's face here, okay, because he promised one thing on the outside, and meanwhile all this has been going on, whether by his knowledge or not, under the radar. Okay, so again, doesn't make Reagan look good. Meanwhile, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the new Soviet premier. Okay, Leonid Brezhnev ends up resigning, and Gorbachev steps in. And Gorbachev marks the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union in many ways, because it's his administration that sees the end of the Cold War. Okay, and there are 3 dramatic initiatives that he introduces as part of his new plan as Soviet premier. One of them is the renewal of the policy of détente. Okay, this is actually a big deal for the Soviet Union to be the one to actually put this forward. Okay, part of it has to do with the fact that the Soviets have been in Afghanistan for a long time. A lot of their spending has gone to that, and the rest of their military spending has gone toward trying to push back against Reagan's Star Wars initiative. Okay, so Soviet Union is effectively bankrupt at this point. He also institutes two new forms of governance when it comes to the Soviet Union. One of them is called Perestroika. This is a Russian term that means restructuring. This is where he's basically allowing the Soviet government to be streamlined, okay, and to provide some kind of transparency to the Soviet people. And the other one is called glasnost. And glasnost is even more specific to the idea of openness. Glasnost just means openness. This is what allows the Soviet Union to be open for debate and for criticism from the Soviet people. Okay, and this is something that would have been absolutely unheard of under the regime of Joseph Stalin. Okay, if anyone spoke out against the government under Stalin, they would simply disappear. Okay, and wind up either in a Russian gulag in Siberia. They might be tortured. They might be killed. Anything could happen to them. Okay, but through glasnost, this is actually allowing the people to criticize the government, to make suggestions, to try to restructure the government somehow through perestroika as well, and essentially for the government to become more democratized. Okay, so again, this is a slow, gradual movement by Gorbachev from a communist system to a democratic system. In October of 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev meet together in Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. And Reagan refuses to call off the Strategic Defense Initiative, okay, which ultimately leads to faltering talks at the very beginning. Okay, seems like he is trying to continue to bluff, even though Gorbachev is already willing to grant multiple massive concessions here. By 1987, though, Gorbachev says he is willing to consider mutual reductions in nuclear weaponry. Okay, so he is actually trying to appease Reagan now by saying that we are willing to step things down. In June, Reagan visits the Berlin Wall in East Germany, and we have a very famous situation where he calls on the Soviet Union to allow greater freedom for its people, for them to be able to actually, again, criticize it more, and to actually have the Soviet Union apologize to the Soviet people for some of the stuff that it's done. And he specifically says, we need to tear down this wall. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. This is the specific wording here. On December 9th, Gorbachev meets with Reagan in Washington, D.C., and they sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. This is something that's been in long-standing ever since. It's recently come under fire under the Trump administration. The president has tried to undo this for one reason or another. And the agreement here is to eliminate the need for missiles that have a range of 300 to 3,000 miles. So basically, we're not willing to allow the buildup of long-range nuclear weapons anymore to try to reduce tensions between the two countries. And Gorbachev also urges the PLO. PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Group. To recognize Israel's right to exist, okay? Because Palestinians, again, still are very much against the presence of Israel and have been Soviet-funded to a certain extent throughout this period. And he also advocates for greater UN action when it comes to the Persian Gulf, okay? And we start to see that become a major region of conflict, especially once we get into the late 80s and the early 90s, when Saddam Hussein begins to focus on Kuwait. By 1988, though, the Soviets begin a phased withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? They finally begin to leave that territory, and the Soviet Union is gradually beginning to be dismantled from within now. Meantime, in the 1980s, a lot of the nations that have been decimated by the destruction of the Second World War are suddenly experiencing higher production levels than the United States when it comes to electronics in particular. Okay, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of U.S. companies are actually outsourcing production to companies overseas. So places like France, West Germany in particular, some cases even the USSR, Japan, and China are all suddenly beginning to make new electronics, videotapes and VHS systems, stereos, and all this kind of stuff because of low labor costs. 1946, if we backtrack a little bit further, one of the major after effects of the Second World War is the development of the first digital electronic computer, okay, at the University of Pennsylvania in 1946. And of course, if you've seen photographs of computers back then, a single computer was the size of a small warehouse. Okay, it took up that much space and that much elaborate circuitry before it could be shrunken down to a much smaller size. Beginning in 1971, though, we have the introduction of microprocessors, okay? And these are small silicon chips that allow for smaller computers to be made, okay? And we start to see the production gradually of desktop computers and personal computers by the time we get to the 1980s, okay? In 1975, Ed Roberts, who you see here at the top, invents the Altair 8800. This is the first personal computer, or PC. And this actually ends up inspiring a young Harvard sophomore named Bill Gates to begin a company called Microsoft out of his garage. And with the efforts of Roberts and Bill Gates, by the 1980s, we have the International Business Machines, IBM, beginning to develop the first microprocessor, making the PC a brand new form of consumer product that people can have in their homes. Okay? And so now people can actually have word processors, they can have the first video games that begin to be introduced in the United States. You see the Pong system up here at the top right. And by the time we get to the 1980s, again, going along with Reagan's plan for the economy, he also urges Americans to purchase as many consumer products as they can because of the tax cuts. He believes this is going to end up injecting more stability and more prosperity into the U.S. economy. And instead, what ends up happening is consumerism ends up running rampant. Okay, most of the national economy shifts from manufacturing major goods in-house to producing them overseas, and most of the industry that actually gets done in the United States is a low-wage service industry. So a lot of fast food joints become more popular. People are getting engaged in places like that. Pizza joints, right, Pizza Hut and places like that become really popular during this time. We start to see new hotel chains becoming popular. So anything that has to do with restaurant industries, service industries like hotels and so forth, these all become really popular in the U.S. And by 1988, 110, I think this is actually supposed to be 110,000 Americans, have an average of 7 credit cards each. Okay, so people are actually buying things on credit more and more and more, and they're getting so far in debt because of this this heedless consumerism that's occurring. Between 1980 and 1989, the federal debt more than triples, goes from $908 billion to $2.9 trillion, in part because of all the consumerism and all the investments that is going on with the federal government, and also because of all the strategic defense buildup that we're doing. In October of 1987, an incident called Black Monday occurs, and this is when the stock market actually ends up plunging, leading to greater fears that a recession is going to occur. Because again, this is very similar to what we saw in the 1920s, right? A lot of new consumer products coming to the forefront, people buying things on credit, and getting so optimistic that they're kind of putting too much of a burden on the stock market. Okay, so if things end up going awry, people could end up potentially losing things all over again. Okay, so a lot of business leaders and economists start attacking Reagan, and they say that we need to start really reducing the federal deficit very, very quickly, or we're going to end up with another Great Depression. So in the 1980s, there are a couple of major epidemics that end up occurring in the United States that deserve more attention that's really been given to them. First one is the epidemic of homelessness that occurs, and beginning in the 1980s and leading all the way to 1990, number of homeless cases ends up skyrocketing to over 400,000. Okay, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that most of the inner city areas that have been largely neglected by federal, state, and local governments in inner cities and so forth, have been essentially put into a situation where the government refers to them as blighted areas. Okay, to the point where they basically are pulling the plug altogether, right? Rather than just give them a small trickle of funding every now and then, they're pulling the plug altogether and coming in and demolishing them. Okay. And the individuals who live there, who have relied on low-cost government housing for a long time are suddenly completely homeless now. They have no other place to go, okay? And it puts them out on the streets. Now, some areas, when it comes to these inner-city, housing projects and so forth, sometimes the government will come in and they will actually institute what they refer to as gentrification. Okay, this is where the area is improved on the outside, right? People will actually, in some case, demolish buildings and build brand new ones, but then they will actually install high-cost living housing, okay, rather than low-cost housing. Okay, so sometimes these housing projects will be destroyed and they will build high-rise apartment complexes, okay, which can only be afforded by those who are from the upper middle and upper class areas of society. Okay, so again, same type of instance where these quote-unquote blighted areas are being destroyed, but in this case, it kind of adds insult to injury to a certain extent. Okay, so again, individuals who rely on low-cost housing now have nowhere else to go. And of course, the working poor who are working in the service industry, now that that's become such a big thing during the 80s, start to see their wages go on the decrease. Okay, Reagan ends up cutting a lot of welfare programs at the same time. And from 1982 to 85, it amounts to $57 billion that gets completely slashed from a lot of the social welfare programs that have been in existence since the 1960s. Okay, so this is not a great time to be alive if you are in the working class, and even if you're a member of the middle class to a certain extent. And if you are a mental patient, okay, quite often, rather than the government actually continuing to fund mental health facilities in the United States, they begin to pull funding from that, and they discharge the patients out on the streets with some sort of medication. Okay, and of course, the patients themselves, in many cases, aren't even able to maintain themselves in one form or another. Okay, so they release them without any kind of housing to go to. In some cases, they're out on the street. If they do take their medication, they run out of it very quickly, and the federal government gives them little to no support whatsoever. Okay, and so the entire epidemic concerning mental health issues and so forth really begins to take hold more and more and more, and becomes very heavily associated with homelessness during the 80s. And of course, drug and alcohol abuse are two things that are also very heavily associated with this. Okay, and the conservative aspect of society, especially during this time period, begins to associate homelessness with drug abuse, with alcohol abuse, and in some cases, yes, that is certainly a factor, but it's not the only factor in most cases. Okay, sometimes the government itself is to blame. In LA County alone, it's estimated that there are over 400,000 cocaine addicts and 200,000 other drug addicts who are in need of treatment. Okay, and about 100,000 homeless or poor just in Los Angeles County only. Okay. And the other thing too, in the early 1980s, beginning with the institution again of the conservative Republican establishment in the government, U.S. public health officials start to report that gay men and intravenous drug users are at greater risk of developing what is called the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. Okay, and again, AIDS has been associated time and time again with the gay community, primarily because of the propaganda that was put forth at the time period by right-wing conservatives. Okay? And the Reagan administration shows very, very little interest in actually doing anything to combat it, again, primarily because it is typecast as a quote-unquote gay disease. Okay? And as we know now, of course, the AIDS virus has virtually nothing to do with the gay community as an exclusive thing. Okay, it can affect anybody. And at the time, again, with the sponsorship of the Reagan administration and the these moral conservatives, you start to see it being portrayed as some form of a divine punishment against those who are living a gay lifestyle. Okay. And so, and again, this is nothing at this point in time, all the way to the 21st century, this has become, unfortunately, a major fixture in evangelical Christianity and the conservative aspect of society. There are still televangelists today who insist that a lot of the natural disasters, a lot of the political and social disasters that have occurred are all some form of divine punishment by a god, one way or another. So again, just having that element on the side of the federal government at this point allows them to make a lot of excuses for things that are caused by completely different factors. And by 2001, it's estimated that nearly 800,000 individuals have contracted the AIDS virus, and over 400,000 people have died as a direct result of it. Okay, and the AIDS virus is, again, it's an autoimmune disease, right? So it causes a person's body to essentially become allergic to itself, and to the point where the immune system is not able to fight off disease. Okay, so many people who contract HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus that leads to the AIDS virus actually coming to full fruition, they end up contracting pneumonia or some kind of illness that could potentially be fought off by a healthy immune system, and that's usually what ends up causing the death in the long run. The AIDS Coalition, which is formed in 1988, eventually ends up spreading a lot more awareness, and annual cases began to drop from 200,000 to about 40,000 from 1988 to 2016. So even still today, it is a major epidemic. Not nearly as bad as it was, but it is still something that needs more attention. By 1988, now that Reagan has served 2 terms in office, his sphere of influence has begun to wane quite a bit. Okay? And his vice president, George H.W. Bush, ends up winning the Republican nomination. Okay? So again, Reagan is not able to serve a 3rd term, and his health is also on the decline as well. Parenthetically, he actually begins to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, right? Something that ends up affecting him more and more and more until his death in 2004. And Bush begins to pledge what he refers to as an ethical government, a more hands-on presidency, and something that he touts as compassionate conservatism. This is his way of basically carrying forward the moral and religious right wing of politics from the Reagan administration, at the same time trying to tout some form of moderate republicanism at the same time. So it's a strange combination here, and it ends up having kind of I hesitate to call it a sinister connotation, but compassionate conservatism kind of smacks a little bit of benevolent paternalism, right? This sense that we've had in the past where, ethnic minorities in particular tend to suffer quite a bit under this type of euphemism, okay? Bush himself is a World War II Navy veteran, and he was America's youngest combat pilot, only at the age of 18 at the time. Graduated from Yale, became a wealthy Texas oil executive, of course, and that's where he gained so much of his fortune here, is in Texas. He's a former House member, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, chair of the Republican National Committee, diplomat to China, and director of the CIA before becoming vice president. So he actually does have a very long and decorated political career, and has a lot of promise as a solid candidate here. And the one thing that he does tout to the American people, and in particular in all this, he says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Okay, and this is a promise that ultimately he is not able to fulfill. Okay, again, he ends up inheriting the Reagan economy, which seems like it's going to do okay for a while, but it's something that's not going to be able to become self-sustaining. Okay, so something has to be done to keep it, to cause it to rebound, and especially when it comes to the federal deficit. And he runs against Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, who runs on the Democratic ticket, and wins a very decisive victory over Dukakis here. Democrats still retain control of the House and the Senate, though, so Bush automatically comes to the presidency with a Congress that's deadlocked against him here. And he ends up consolidating most of Reagan's initiatives rather than what he refers to as remaking society. In other words, he basically picks up on what his boss did before and continues most of it on forward through the late 80s and into the early 90s. And he ends up supporting the Democratic proposed Americans with Disabilities Act, which is to his credit. This is something that has been very... On November 29, 1990, Bush signs into law the Bipartisan Immigration Act of 1990. This is initially going to allow an increase in the number of immigrants annually to 700,000. This extends from 1992 to 1994, and ends up capping immigration at 675,000 people a year after 1994. Okay. adds more preferences for people who are skilled workers and professionals, right? So not just unskilled workers and migrant workers and that kind of thing. So he's trying to somehow basically ramp up the appeal of the workers themselves who are coming over. And he also tries to institute what's called a diversity lottery to basically say he's going to assign random visas to immigrants regardless of their nation of origin. Okay. Also, he lifts a ban on suspected quote-unquote homosexual immigrants, which was established in 1965, right? So again, even still, this is something where the United States has tried to institutionalize an anti-gay agenda at the same time, even beginning in 1965 when there was still a Democratic president in office. Okay, so it was, again, continued because, in large part because of the Republican conservatism of the 70s. In 1989, the national debt stands at $2.6 trillion, again, mostly in part because of Ronald Reagan's insistence that we ramp up spending to, quote-unquote, win the Cold War. Okay? And Bush is unwilling to slash any of these defense or social welfare budgets. He says that it's a fiscal mess. Okay? By slashing any defense budgets, we're basically backing down in the face of the Soviets, and the social welfare budgets, he's not really willing to slash any more of that because he believes that Reagan has done enough with it. Okay? And this is where he ends up kind of having to backpedal on his initial promise of no new taxes. He says that we have to increase taxes just to try to balance things out, right? Because we're not willing to slash any other budgets. Okay? And of course, this has the adverse effect of leading to eroding political support, and the government ends up shutting down too. Okay, the main bargaining chip to reopen the government is actually a Democrat-led budget proposal, and the new budget becomes a lasting rift between Bush and the congressional Republicans. Okay, so congressional Republicans, who are a minority at this point, believe that he's basically made too many concessions to the other side. And the economy is not really known for growing much during Bush's first 3 years in office. In fact, it's actually in a full recession by the time we get to 1991. Now, by the time we get to the end of the decade of the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev has decided to fully democratize the Soviet Union. And this has, again, led to a lot of improved relations with the West. We've already talked about Glasnost and Perestroika. In addition to that, in 1989, with the Soviets leaving Afghanistan, Gorbachev makes a dramatic decision here that leads to a large chain reaction, in that he allows self-governance for all other Soviet-ruled nations. Okay, and this is a promise that Joseph Stalin made back in 1945 when we entered into a treaty between him, Roosevelt and Churchill, right? I believe it was at Yalta when the three of them had this major conference. Stalin agreed that we were going to allow self-determination in the eastern bloc of the Soviet Union, and here we are, right? It takes until 1989 for it to actually occur. And immediately, several countries in Eastern Europe end up experiencing revolutions. So Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria all immediately begin to topple the puppet dictatorships that exist in each one of these countries. And Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia all end up regaining status as independent nations very quickly thereafter. The last holdout is Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu. Okay, he is actually captured on Christmas Eve, I believe, and is executed Christmas Day along with his wife. Okay, and Ceausescu is known for being an autocratic dictator himself. He and his wife both lived very extravagant lifestyle while the people of Romania were starving. Okay, so they were very quick to put an end to his regime once all this happened. And the big precipitating moment comes on November 9th of 1989, when tens of thousands of East and West Germans come together and end up demolishing the Berlin Wall. Okay, and this is something that is televised. You can see footage of this on YouTube everywhere, and it's the when the curtain falls on the Cold War, when it actually comes to a full end. Okay. October 3rd of 1990, Germany is officially reunited as a single country for the first time since 1945. Okay, so this is a major, major change and everything. And it's really the world turning the corner for the first time since 1945. Again, this is the end of the Cold War and the beginning of rampant globalization that we begin to see occur, where the countries of the world suddenly begin to engage in commerce with one another, exchanging ideas, exchanging politics, for good or for bad. Okay, and we'll see some of the fallout for that eventually in the coming chapters as well. Gorbachev, though, ends up suffering from a dramatic drop in popularity in the Soviet Union for obvious reasons. There are still members of the old communist regimes that have been around for a long period of time, and they think that he has betrayed the Communist Party. They believe that he has basically become an enemy of the Soviet Union, and that he's just simply a traitor, right? That he is too much of a Western sympathizer. In August of 1991, Gorbachev is actually accosted in the Crimea by these old guard communists while he's on vacation, and they demand that he transfer power back to them so that they can try to rebuild the Soviet Union as much as they can. And Bush actually responds favorably to Gorbachev by agreeing with Boris Yeltsin, who actually ends up taking over for Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin requests aid for Gorbachev here, and Bush sends in several troops actually in to help rescue him. Okay, and so the communists end up fleeing and or committing suicide in the aftermath of this. Gorbachev himself is freed from captivity and actually ends up resigning as head of the Communist Party. Okay, so now Boris Yeltsin is made the head of what eventually becomes the Russian Federation. And we see statues of Lenin and Stalin suddenly being destroyed all across Europe, like you see in the background. Okay, so all of these former Soviet states now in Eastern Europe, all of the Baltic states suddenly revert back to independent status, and we no longer have the presence of the USSR anymore. Okay, so officially, the Cold War has now come to an end, and we face a brand new decade and, in a few years, a brand new millennium.